This comic review is rated R for language. Now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other two books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online bookstores everywhere today. After reading Milestone Returns 0 and Milestone Returns 0 Ultimate Edition, I knew going into the first issue of Static it was going to be a certified shit show. And your first issue of Static not only exceeds my expectations on being a complete shit show, it just shows me how your Reginald Hudlin really has no understanding of comics and really does not understand how the comics publishing business works. Now, this first issue of Static is supposed to be the first comic anybody reads as related to the Milestone universe, and it's supposed to be the flagship book of the series. And a flagship book is supposed to leave a strong first impression on the reader, but this first issue just had me more than disappointed. It had me absolutely disgusted. Now, this first issue should have really reintroduced the Virgil Hawkins character and established a reason to care about him. Unfortunately, due to the mismanaged editorial over at Milestone, we have to go and read Milestone Returns and Milestone Returns 0 in order to be able to even jump into this series. So this book is already starting off on a bad foot because the first issue doesn't do what a good first issue is supposed to do. And a good first issue is supposed to introduce us to the hero, establish what he wants to do, and make us care about that character. But in this first issue, we have to go and jump back to two other issues, and that doesn't really make a person want to just come in and just start reading what they have in their hands. Because when in comic publishing, you have to understand that the book that somebody has in their hands, this is the book that's supposed to leave a strong first impression on them. And if people aren't impressed with that first issue, they're not coming back for back issues. Because when I go out here and I write books like the Isis series or the East-Steam or the John Haynes series, I know that the first book that is in the reader's hands, this is the book that's going to give a reader an incentive to whether to go back and pick up the back issues or anticipate the next issue. And I have to make sure that I bring my best to the table in that one book that's in the reader's hands. And when I looked at this first issue of Static, it wasn't the very best as related to this character. No, this book pales in comparison to the fantastic work that Dwayne McDuffie did back in 1993 when he introduced the Static character. Because in 1993, when Dwayne McDuffie introduced the Static character, he knew that he had one shot and he needed to make that one shot count as related to the Static character, and he practically knocked that first issue out of the park, introducing the character, establishing the conflict, and then introducing the bad guy, Hot Streak. But in this first issue of Static, instead of us focusing on showing us reasons to care about this character and introducing them and showcasing their powers, we get Vita Ayala showing us why she should not be writing this character at all. Because in this first issue of Static, instead of us getting some action on the first page, no, we have an establishing shot of the Hawkins home and then Virgil talking about his feelings regarding his powers. And that's just completely out of character for Virgil Hawkins. Virgil Hawkins does not sit there talking about his feelings. No, that is something a female does, because females talk about their feelings as related to things, because females are emotional. Now, seeing somebody talking about feelings, that's something that a character like I did in my novel Spellbound, Matilda Crowley, a girl would do, but a boy is focused on logic and focused on problem solving. And that's what is the difference between this relaunch of Static and the 1993 version. The 93 version, because it came from a man, focuses on a teenage boy from a male perspective, whereas Vita Ayala's version focuses on a teenage boy from a female perspective. And because we're seeing things from a gynocentric perspective as related to Virgil Hawkins, that's why the story really does not capture the spirit of who Virgil Hawkins is, and it doesn't really capture the heart of who the character is, because Vita Ayala approaches Virgil Hawkins from an emotional perspective instead of showing us a logical perspective. Now, when Dwayne originally created the Static character, he wanted to talk about the struggles of teenage black boys as related to being a superhero, and none of those struggles are really presented here, because in this version of Static, everything is about your Virgil's feelings about being bullied, and those feelings practically make the story meander in this comic, because you got Virgil talking about, oh, there's a buzzing in his head, there's a charge that runs throughout his blood, raising all the hair on his body until it needs out. That's not a metaphor. Francis Stone is a bully, and there's only so much I can take. I mean, when I read this first page, I was thinking about what I wrote in the first page of my novel Spellbound, because he sounds like Matilda Crowley. He sounds like a girl. I mean, he does not sound like a boy. He sounds like a girl. So I'm going to take a minute and, take you over to the first page of Spellbound. If I can, I'm going to go over into my files and see if I can go over here. But it sounds like Spellbound. I mean, he's talking about his feelings about things, and boys don't talk about their feelings in a comic. I mean, people want to see a superhero talking about going out here, and yes, they're having issues with things, but the way he's talking, I mean, I'm gonna read you an excerpt of Spellbound, the first page, and on the first page, the Matilda character says, My life is like a horror movie, give or take a scene. I feel the eyes of Park West's most popular girls pointing daggers at me from the back of the classroom. I'd like to ask them what they're looking at. I like to ask them what their problem is, but because I want to live to see another day in this hellhole of a high school, I just do my best to listen to Mrs. Lubbock talk about the Civil War. So when I looked at the first page of Static, it took me back to my own novel, Spellbound. Again, I'm writing about a female, and you've got Virgil Hawkins sounding just like a female. And this goes back to a video I talked about how DC Comics had effeminized Static, and this effeminization of Static really shows here because he's talking about feelings and we're not getting into action. If you look at the 93 first issue of Static, we get right to the action, and the Static character is shown showcasing his powers as he takes out some gang members in an arcade. And as he's taking out the gang members in the arcade, this builds into his feud with Hotstreak as Virgil Hawkins and as Static, and that builds very nicely into the climax of that first issue. But this first issue, because it focuses on feelings, is very passive, and because it's very passive, the images in it don't really draw you in to make you care. And compound this with you having to look at two other previous issues, this really slows down the pacing of the story as related to this reintroduction of the character. Now, if you're a new reader and you start to pick up this book, you really don't know where everything is or where it's going, and that's going to really not give you an incentive to go out here and pick up that second issue. So this whole first issue really comes from the wrong perspective, and because Vita Ayala is writing from feelings, she really does not understand how the Virgil Hawkins character is supposed to work, and she doesn't understand how bullying for males is completely different than it is for females. Because as somebody who has been bullied, I know that there's a difference between male bullying and female bullying. And what we get in this first issue of Static is bullying from a female perspective. Everything is about emotion, everything is about feelings, and everything is about acting on impulse, because the Virgil character, as he attacks Hot Streak in this story, is acting on emotion and not the logic that the Virgil from 93 did. Everything that the Virgil from 93 did was about logic, about critical thinking, and about using his critical thinking skills along with science to defeat the enemy. But in this book, everything is about Virgil's feelings, and this makes the character act like a completely different character. Now, when I look at this book, it feels like a really bad YA novel that really doesn't have a good sense of characterization and character development. And again, Virgil is all in his feelings, and that's just not who Virgil is. Now, Virgil, while he may have his struggles and may have his issues, always had a sense of hope and optimism, and it was always that hope and optimism that made you want to go out here and read Static, because Virgil, while he had his struggles, always had dealt with things with a sense of humor, and I really missed that whole sense of humor that Virgil used to have in his old series, because Virgil was always known for cracking jokes, Virgil was always known for having a good laugh, and Virgil was always known for his love of things like comics, fantasy, and science fiction, and we didn't get any of those concepts presented here as related to his character. These are things that were core to who he was. I mean, Virgil was a big role-playing game guy, he was a big video game guy, he was a big comic book guy, and these are things that weren't presented in this first issue. No, all of that took a back seat because Vita Ayala and your Reginald Hudlin wanted to give us this brooding, angry, effeminized character and not give us the strong, masculine character Dwayne McDuffie created. I mean, I looked at this book and I looked at the way the art was presented. Everything was about feelings, and that's a feminine perspective as related to black manhood, and it's from the outside looking in, because when I looked at this book, I didn't see any of the things I would struggle with, because I was a guy who was bullied, so I understand the struggles a boy goes through. And what I saw in the second issue of Static is him trying to solve the problem. And again, everything with boys is about logic and problem solving, but with this one, I got everything about feelings. And that just shows me, again, this woman is not fit to write the character. Now, as the book progresses, we get a couple of pages talking about the riot that went on, which I really was disappointed with, because instead of them making it a big bang about a gang rumble, Virgil's origin has been turned into this Black Lives Matter rally, and that takes the character and changes the character completely, and again, pushes on the theme of feminization, because the only reason why he's going there is because he wants to impress the Frida character. And again, that makes Virgil into a simp, and it doesn't make it about what the original Static was all about, which was problem solving, because Virgil was having problems with the bully Francis, who was Hot Streak, and he wanted to deal with Francis, and he thought, oh, if I go to this rumble and I take him out with a gun, I'll be able to deal with him. But that's when he makes the choice that defines him as a hero, and that choice was erased from this version of Static, and it was one of the things that actually makes me extremely angry about this whole relaunch of Static, because that choice is the thing that defines him as a hero. The thing that makes Virgil a hero is that fact that he will not go out here and stoop to Hot Streak's level and participate in an act of murder. No, he understands that, yes, I have my issues with this guy, but I'm going to go out here and navigate through my emotions and act in a logical and critical thinking fashion, and I'm not going to do something where I wind up crossing the line. I mean, that is who Virgil Hawkins is. He is a hero because before he got his powers, and what made him a hero was that choice to drop that gun in the Dakota River. And he dropped that gun in the Dakota River because the difference between a hero and a villain is a hero looks to solve problems without doing harm to others, and a villain will just take the most quick approach based on feelings. So this whole first issue really does not really it erases the choice that Virgil made and makes it all about this conspiracy theory as related to this alva gas. And we have this guy who's looking like the guy from he's doing a radio show, and they're doing this conspiracy theory. But when I look at this whole thing with Static is looking like Matilda Crowley in Spellbound, and he's going to become completely effeminized throughout this story. And as the story goes on, we just see your Virgil approaching everything from a feminine perspective. And I was deeply disappointed because everything that is related to Virgil growing into manhood is completely erased in this adaptation of Static. And all we get throughout this version of Static is him talking about feelings, and that's not the character that I grew up with, and that's not the character an entire generation that watched the Static Shock show grew up with. And this version in this relaunch has been softened, he's been effeminized, he's been weakened, and the writer again has no real sense of the character. And as he comes back home from school, we really start to see how this writer really didn't know who this character is, because at the dinner table where we're supposed to get Virgil making all of the gags that he usually gets into, we get more of a somber version of Virgil, and he doesn't really become the fun character that he was in the classic 93 series or the Static Shock show, who was always looking to drop a gag or crack a joke. I mean, that's not really presented here. And as the whole dinner between the family goes on, we start to see how your Reginald Hudlin and your Dennis Cowan and your Vita Ayala really fuck this character up. And that goes on when in a table sequence when they're at the dinner table, and your father knows that Virgil has powers, and the family knows he has powers. I mean, this is where the Static comic goes from being a series that could possibly have picked up where the old one left off and turns into a Greg Berlanti version of a comic book. And in this Greg Berlanti version, everybody knows Virgil has powers, and then as they're trying to talk about this hot streak problem, they sit there and they talk about how Virgil needs to go back to martial arts. Now, that is completely out of character for the Virgil character, and that it's completely out of character because your Virgil never knew anything about martial arts. I mean, if he knew something about martial arts, then he would have dealt with this hot streak character way back in his early days of adolescence as a freshman. And that's what usually guys who know martial arts do when they run into a bully. If they know martial arts, they're going to use that almost immediately on this dude, and that would have been the end of it. So your Vita Ayala tries to introduce this martial arts training in as a story point, but really doesn't understand that those kids who train in martial arts and have their fathers in their lives, they don't usually have too many problems with bullies, because they usually deal with the bullies themselves by solving the problem by beating the crap out of them. So she introduces a story point that really takes the character out of character and really makes her entire story fall completely apart. And when I looked at that whole sequence right there, it was one that really again showed me that this woman really does not understand about manhood. She doesn't understand anything about masculinity, and she's approaching this character, Milestone's flagship character, from a female perspective, and that is completely fucking up the entire book and the entire Milestone line. Because when you don't know how the world works for a man, and that the world works completely different for a man, than it does for a woman, and you're working on a teenage boys series, then you don't really understand how things work for a teenage boy when he is a hero. Because the way a teenage boy is a hero is different than a teenage girl, and a teenage girl is going to approach things differently than a teenage boy would approach them. Again, when Dwayne McDuffie wrote the original Static series, he wrote it from a male perspective because we were not getting the stories from black boys or the stories from a black boy's perspective. And again, a boy's perspective of about solving problems is through logic and reason. And a lot of boys will think critically about something, because I remember being 16, 17 years old, and that's when I started really doing some real critical thinking. And that was one of the things I liked about Virgil, was he did some critical thinking in that issue where he made the choice and dropped the gun in the river because he was doing critical thinking. But in this book, everything is about feelings. And again, when I read this book, I just thought about Matilda Crowley in my novel Spellbound, because the way the Virgil Hawkins character was acting was just like a female. And again, it shows that the writers doesn't understand things from a black man's perspective, and that's where your Hudlin and Cowan made a mistake in hiring this woman to write this character, a teenage boy. She just does not understand how things work for boys. And then as the book progresses, we get the confrontation between Hot Streak and Virgil. And this version of the confrontation, they escalate things based on a previous event that took place here in New York with a Long Island guy named John White, a black man who had a white teenager come to his house because his son was interested in a white girl. And it looks like your Vita Ayala wanted to pick up on that to make a story point, but it makes the whole first issue completely fall apart and completely collapse into oblivion, because this whole sequence, this final sequence, it doesn't have the emotional resonance that the first issue of Static had. And this first issue really starts to crumble because he comes out in front of their house and he and Virgil have this big fight. But because everything is emotions and not about critical thinking, this whole sequence just makes for the book just completely collapse, and just makes a terrible issue into an absolutely awful issue, and just takes us away from who the Virgil character is, and takes us away from everything that really matters about the character. I mean, this first issue is not an absolute. It's just absolutely disgusting that this book just again takes us away from all of the elements that make Static great. And this writer, because she writes from a female perspective, really does not understand the struggles of black men, black masculinity, and black manhood. And this book, again, takes a great black male hero and effeminizes him and has him acting soft, has him acting weak, has him in his feelings, has him not thinking about things critically, and has him not being the hero we all knew from the 93 comic series or the hero we knew from the Static Shock show. No, we don't get that character. We get a complete wimp, a beta male, and this version of Static is an absolute and utterly disgusting version that I cannot recommend to anyone. I mean, stick with the 93 series, stick with the Static Shock show, just avoid this book. And if this book is supposed to be the big flagship book, then I see the Milestone relaunch sinking, and I see it sinking and breaking in half like the Titanic. And the reason why I see it sinking is because in comics, again, you only get one chance to make a first impression, and you need to bring your best work to the table in that first issue. And you need to give me a reason to care about that character to pick up that next issue. But this book doesn't give you any incentive to pick up the next issue. All it does is give you an incentive to drop this book and eventually wind up dropping the line because the storytelling here is completely off. And if I were running Milestone, I would pick anybody but Vita Ayala to write my flagship character like Static. No, I would try to get John Rossum to come in because John Rossum was Dwayne's friend, and I would have gotten him to write this first issue so that we could get Virgil as Dwayne originally created him and honor the late great Dwayne McDuffie, because this book is a disgrace to the Dwayne McDuffie's name. This book practically betrays everything Dwayne McDuffie created the character to be, and this book practically is a complete betrayal of everything Dwayne McDuffie designed this character to be like, and does not capture the spirit or the heart of Virgil Hawkins. And it's just all about your Reginald Hudlin's ego and trying to appeal to his far left friends, and not about trying to give us this character as he was originally designed to be, and not about trying to give us an entertaining, fun story that captures that heart of what Virgil was all about, and give us a comic book character who I know readers would have loved and would have enjoyed had they given us a good issue. Now, if I was writing Static, you would have gotten Static Season 5, like after the end of the Static Shock show, and I would have tried to have stayed true to the heart and the spirit of both the 93 comic and the 2001 series, and I would have tried to keep Static all about him growing into manhood, him learning about how to think critically, and him going out here and doing the things that teenage boys and young men do. And that's what I didn't really get a sense of, because, again, you have a female writing a character from the outside looking in, and not like Dwayne, who was writing us from the experiences that he experienced. And that's where this book just completely crumbles into dust, because instead of us getting a story from a black boy's perspective from a black man, we get a story from a woman's perspective, and that woman really shows us why she's a poor fit for this character. Now, if you want to try my first comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Amazon.com for 99 cents on Kindle. And if you want to pick up my African American fantasy series, like the ISIS series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, like Spellbound, you can find all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black. Get your copy today at your favorite online bookseller.